Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners! Once upon a time, when the Eurasian steppe was governed by Turkic and Mongolic nomadic tribes and people lived according to the rhythm of nature, they worshipped Tengri, the god of the sky. Genghis Khan and the rulers of the Turkic Khaganates adhered to this belief system, known as Tengrism, before Islam began to spread across the region in the 8th century. However, Tengrism was never fully eradicated. Its practices survived among Central Asian communities in the everyday rituals, customs, and beliefs. While the Soviet Union sought to suppress it through systemic atheism, Tengrism, like Islam, persisted underground. In the late 1980s, with perestroika, the ancient belief system gained new traction among people in the region who were longing for purpose and a renewed sense of belonging. Yet, in the ensuing years, through the collapse of the Soviet Union and the nation-building processes across newly independent Central Asia, Tengrism, unlike Islam, never became the dominant faith. Why is that? What is Tengrism in the first place? And why did Kazakhstan refuse to register it as an official religion? To explore these questions and more, I have invited Abigail Scripka, a doctoral candidate at the Leibniz Centre for Contemporary History in Potsdam, Germany, who studies Tengrism in Kazakhstan with a particular focus on the period of perestroika. Welcome to Turan Talks. Hi, Abi. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Hi, it's nice to see you. Thank you for inviting me.
I would like to talk to you today about Tengrism, so something that you have been researching for your PhD for a while, mostly focusing on Kazakhstan. So maybe let's start from the very beginning. What is Tengrism?
Yeah, I think to even ask what is Tengrism is such a difficult question to answer because ultimately everybody you ask is going to have a very different impression of what this term means and how they relate to it themselves. And so at the most basic of understanding, Tengrism is the worship of the sky god Tengri or Tengir, which is a sky god that we see represented in petroglyphs with a sun for a head and then a human body. And that the tenets of Tengrism are focused on worldly balance between the upper world, the world we live in, and the underworld. And how can we function and live with balance with the earth and these three worlds. And so this is not particularly unique when we think about historic pagan religions across not just the Eurasian steppe, but when we look into Western and Northern Europe to North America, South America, Africa, and indigenous people all over the world, they practice something that is very concerned with our relationship with the earth and how do we protect it. And so I think this is the most basic definition that I don't think most people would disagree with me on. And where it becomes a bit hairy is kind of the modern conceptualization of Tengrism, which we'll talk more about as we go on.
Tell me, what was Tengrism's territorial reach? And was it like the first and the main belief system in the Eurasian steppe?
So we have evidence of the worship of the sky god Tengri, but not necessarily the way that it functions as an organized religion. So we can't think about Tengrism the way that we think about Islam or Christianity or Judaism, where there's a book and a set of traditions and a specific way to worship. But Tengrism encapsulates the modern Eurasian steppe. So North Asia, looking at the Sakha people, the Buryat people, and going down to Mongolia, looking at modern Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, even records of it in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, in Turkey, and Azerbaijan.
So what do we know about the main rituals or holidays in Tengrism and whether they differed depending on the location they were practiced?
So what I think is really interesting about this question is a couple years ago, I was visiting the Palace of Peace and Reconciliation in Kazakhstan. And I was looking for kind of any recognition of Tengrism by the Kazakh state. And what I found was they have this exhibition that talks about religions of Kazakhstan. And within it, there's a section on Zoroastrianism. And I click on this and it creates a drop-down menu where it lists the different Zoroastrian religions of Kazakhstan, listing Tengrism as one of them. And this was the first time that I had ever seen Tengrism conceptualized as like an offshoot of Zoroastrianism, because I think of Tengrism as being distinctly Turco-Mongolic, whereas Zoroastrianism I think of as more Persian with Turkic influence and its effect on Turkic religious identity. And so when we relate it to Zoroastrianism, you do start to see these similarities of the use of fire, the use of oil, ancestor-related worship. Yeah, I think those are the three main ones to focus on, where even in Islam, there's the practice of the Friday buns, where they fry the buns in oil. And this is something that is at times construed into a Tengrist practice because we don't see it outside of Central Asia. And it's the use of the oil, it's the use of the fire, and the way that it evokes different spiritual traditions. And so this is something that I have found people closely relate to Tengrism in their practice. And whether or not they, depending on location, is not something that I have seen. I find that these practices are, at the most basic level, quite similar across the territory of Kazakhstan. And also, one that I forgot is the alastau cleaning, where they burn adraspan to cleanse the body and the home. And this is something that I see very often in my field work when I travel to different religious sites, where this is something I would also associate with a Zoroastrian or Tengrist religious practice.
Okay, so now a difficult question because I think I'm a little bit lost.
Okay.
So what's the difference between Zoroastrianism and Tengrism and also shamanism? Because these are very often used interchangeably, which probably is wrong, right? I mean, you as an expert, can you explain it to us? What are the differences between the three?
I think ultimately it comes down to the myths of each practice. And so when we talk about Tengrism, we think about the Mother Umai, we think about the sky god Tengri, and there's several other different Turkic myths that I'm not as familiar with. These are the two that I know best, if I'm honest. And I think it's really hard to uncouple all of these ideas. And I have spent the last 2 years interviewing shamans, healers, and fortune tellers across Kazakhstan, trying to unpack everyday religious life and understand the way that they think about their own religious identity. And all of these shamans identify as being Muslim. And when I actually have brought up the term Tengrism, and in Kazakh I'll say like Tengrishulduk, they begin to talk about fundamentalist Muslims, and they actually associate this term with a more conservative form of Islam than what they practice. But when you talk to young people in Almaty or in Astana, and you talk about shamans, they say, this is our Tengrist past. This is like a holdover from before the Soviet Union, or as the term that's been coined, like the survivals or perestroika. And so I think Tengrism is kind of interesting when we look at the modern Kazakh youth and the way that they want to feel in touch with a religious identity, but don't relate to Islam for a multitude of reasons. And so I think actually in a way, Tengrism, I'm not really answering your question properly, I realized, but I think Tengrism functions as almost like a religious escape, a way to maintain tradition and identity without having to feel like they're participating in a religion that they don't identify with. And so my master's thesis was actually about Tengrism as a youth movement in Almaty amongst 18 to 30-year-olds and how they relate to this. And my main takeaway was I actually don't necessarily feel comfortable calling Tengrism its own religion, because I think the conceptualization of it is, well, we can be kind of like German academic about it. Like, what is a religion and why is Tengrism a religion and why is it not? But there's an idea of political Tengrism, there's ideas of cultural Tengrism, there's ideas of Tengrism just as fashion even, like looking into how jewelry is revived, people relate this to steppe religion and steppe culture. And so is Tengrism a religion? Or is it like an escape to a nomadic past?
This is super interesting, and I think we should unpack each of those things, what Tengrism is, and we'll do it in a second. I just would like to go back a little bit.
Sorry.
It's okay. I mean, I think it's really fascinating. So you mentioned the myths of Tengrism. Maybe you can tell us something more about that. Like, what do people believe in, or what is the main kind of myth that Tengrists refer to?
It's given the namesake, it is the myth of the sky god Tengri, or the blue Tengri myth, which is basically that the sky god Tengri is There are people who are much better versed in this than me, because I don't focus as much on Turkic mythology in my research, but it's the idea that the earth was created by the sky god Tengri, and that Tengri is the sky. And so when we evoke the idea of the eternal steppe, or the eternal sky of the Kazakhs, it's the idea that in the sky is Tengri. And so it's essentially a earth creation myth, and that we must maintain this balance because we are worshipping a big man in the sky. And so I think this is the fundamental myth that we see being evoked by Tengrists, especially given it's the name that's been given to the religious practice. Prior to the term Tengrism, which became popularized in the 80s, we just have the cults of Tengri. And so this worship of them, because Tengri I don't think has a gender either, but the worship of Tengri and the evocation of this is largely used for like environmental movements as well, which is how I kind of became interested in this.
Hey, quick little break. Thanks for listening to Turan Tales. We're a tiny independent show supported by listeners like you. If you like our work, you can get a paid subscription at turantales.substack.com/subscribe or buymeacoffee.com/turantales. Okay, back to the episode. So, do we know anything about when Tengrism stopped being a popular belief system in the Eurasian steppes? What was the moment when its popularity faded?
I think that its popularity or relevance essentially faded. I don't think it ever went away. I am in this camp that it survived the Soviet Union because people continued to worship and practice in private. But definitely the anti-religious campaigns of the Soviet Union were a huge influence in basically people retreating from practicing. And it would eventually, I think a lot of these practices would become retransformed into national culture by the Soviet Union to become more tolerant, especially as Islam was allowed back into public life in the late 40s and 50s under Stalin. And so we see it fade after the formation of the Soviet Union. We have anti-shaman propaganda, we have anti-Islamic propaganda, and because what this practice is and what this religious identity is and worship structure is so hard to define and is so hard to even call a religion, people became afraid and ultimately chose, even though it's hard to say if the Soviets would have tolerated these kind of cultural practices, if framed as a cultural practice and not a religious practice, people were still afraid to even participate. And so what we have left today are those who felt strong enough to keep these practices through the Soviet Union, even in secret, and to continue practicing and passing down their own knowledge in order to preserve it in whatever capacity we have.
And how does Tengrism relate to Navruz, for example? Because we were talking about Tengrism being seen as a form of Zoroastrianism. Does Navruz belong to how Tengrism is understood in Kazakhstan today?
This is very controversial, actually, to declare if Navruz is a Tengrist holiday, because even calling it just Persian New Year is quite controversial because it's not just Persians who practice it. I am of the belief that I think there are traditions that are practiced in Navruz, which are very similar and can be related to Tengrism, but I would not personally go as far to say that it is a Tengrist holiday, especially because we have so much historical data directly relating it to Zoroastrianism and Zoroastrian practice. But I think this is, again, like an interesting point of how do people in Kazakhstan specifically try to reframe their cultural traditions into a religious identity that they feel they can relate to better.
Let's move to the time that is closer to us. So what happened after the Soviet Union collapsed? Because we know that when Kazakhstan and the whole Central Asia became independent countries, what gained popularity was Islam, and also political Islam. This was a big issue in Uzbekistan. But how about Tengrism? Has it also gained so much popularity in Central Asia, or maybe in Kazakhstan, as Islam in the early 90s?
In the late 80s, even, in the early 90s, we begin to see the popularity of talking about visiting the shaman, the Turkic creation myths, and even Tengrism appearing in newspapers and magazines. And this is the time frame I study, the 80s and 90s. And so we see a popular resurgence, which is very much in line with what we also see in other parts of the Soviet Union, looking at like occult beliefs, paganism, Buddhism, and looking into kind of alternative religious identity. But in these newspapers and magazines, it's framed as traditional religious beliefs of Kazakhs, and is also relating them very strongly to Islam. Even when we're using the term Tengrism, they're still talking about it kind of in the context of Islam. But there seems to be a process of re-education happening in the Kazakh public, saying, these are some songs you can sing when you visit a shaman. These are the gifts you should bring. This is how you visit a shaman. And then on the other hand, you have, like in the ad sections of newspapers, shamans and imams advertising their services, saying, if you come to me, I'll make it rain so your crops will grow. If you come to me, I'll help you become pregnant. And so there becomes this kind of almost cult relationship with the shaman, and the way that people connect the shaman in Tengrism is something that I think is starting to happen in the 90s. As for Tengrism in like the early 2000s, which was also when I first became familiar with it, it was actually an ecological movement. And so I wrote my bachelor's thesis on religious secularism in Central Asia.
You've been with Tengrism forever.
I know. My bachelor's supervisor was like, you're still talking about Tengrism a decade later.
Yeah.
But we see at the Akimat people fighting for regulation on the environment to prevent climate change, to clean the air in Almaty, etc. And these people have linked themselves with Tengrism, and they evoke Tengrist ideology, claiming we have to have balance with the earth, and if we destroy the earth, then what do we have? And the reason we have all these problems is because we don't respect the environment. And then when you look at Tatarstan, which has a huge movement of political Tengrism in the 90s, which is where this movement kind of started and then transferred into Central Asia, we see Tengrist intellectuals writing books against Islam. And they have warnings as to like the downfalls of Islam and what it can do to society to not participate in the religious tradition that is of your people. And so we have this complicated resurgence in Central Asia, where in Kazakhstan it hasn't been as potent as it has been in Tatarstan, and also in Kyrgyzstan, where there's a huge youth movement. They meet on Fridays, apparently, in an abandoned swimming pool. This is what I've been told. I've never personally met them. And that
wow.
There's like a Tengri Fest. Well, there's Tengri Fest, as you and I are probably familiar, which is like a big Turkic culture concert. But there's also like a Tengrism secret meeting that happens every year where like hundreds of people meet and discuss their practice together, which I've also only been told about and haven't had the privilege of attending. I'm hoping to change that soon.
But wait, so these are people who treat it as a religious movement?
Yes.
Or a religious practice. Okay. I know that there is a group like that in Kazakhstan who has been trying to register their movement as a religion. But they have been denied repeatedly. So can we talk about them and why Kazakhstan doesn't want to register Tengrism as a religion?
Yes, definitely. I've also met with them. They're very nice. I think the complication with registering Tengrism as a religion in Kazakhstan is, I think the Kazakh government recognizes that this is extremely controversial, and that I have personally received death threats for my research telling me that I am trying to divide Kazakhstan, that I am promoting a haram belief, essentially, that the only God is Allah, of course, and being told that if I continue my research, I'm endangering not just the people of Kazakhstan, but also myself. And I don't take these very seriously because there's fanaticism in every single religion. And I'm glad to see they care so much about their religious identity. But I think that the Kazakh government knows that if they engage in Tengrism any further than they already have, as in using like Tengri News, Tengri Bank, which no longer exists, evoking the idea of Tengri in different aspects of life is okay because Tengri as a figure is not controversial, but to try and legitimize it with a religion would upset a lot of people because there is an idea that these people are Islamophobic, that they are trying to divide Kazakh society, that they are fanatics in their own right. And the public perception of Tengrists, for those who are aware of them, is extremely negative if they are not also involved in this movement. And so my only assumption would be that the Kazakh government knows that this would be massively controversial, and also that it isn't a situation where they feel that a majority of the population supports this movement or would be open to it being recognized as a religion. Whereas when we see other bills being passed in Kazakhstan that do actually, unfortunately, have large public support, and so it would go against their better interest, is the only explanation I've been able to find within my research. Otherwise, I don't see what the harm is in recognizing Tengrism as a religion would be.
You say that in your fieldwork you visit shamans.
Yes.
Which is fascinating. In my work as a journalist, I visited a few shamans in my life too. And these are, some of the highlights of my career, like the most memorable situations. Tell me what exactly this practice or like practicing shamanism or practicing Tengrism looks like based on your experience in your fieldwork.
So this is something that what differs between regions is actually the practice of naming and also what is more popular. And so I started my fieldwork in Mangostau in Western Kazakhstan, where I have done all of my interviews and all of my work with my really incredible research assistant, Kamsha Akmoratova, and she's from Aktau. So it was a natural place to begin, where we would visit different auliers or locations where saints are buried that were famous for having a healer, because in Western Kazakhstan, they're referred to as a yamshi. And they all have their own specialty. And because essentially the process of becoming a shaman is you experience a calling, and it's typically embodied as a shamanic sickness. So either you have physical bruises, you lose your eyesight, you have dreams, you become sick. And this is a calling to practice with your powers, that you have these powers and you have to practice them. And so many of the people I've interviewed, which has mostly been women, are specialists in fertility, actually, which I think reflects larger concerns of Kazakh society of wanting to have children and issues related to that. But in the West was the first place that I experienced kind of a commercialization of shamanism, where you would WhatsApp message a shaman or a healer or even a fortune teller, and they would send you back a price list. So they would say, do you want to quit gambling? 20,000 tenge. Would you like a bata? 5,000 tenge.
What is a bata?
Charging 5,000 tenge. It's a blessing, which is crazy to charge 5,000 tenge for, which is when you say a bata at the beginning of a meal in Kazakhstan when you're with religious company. And removing the evil eye is 15,000 tenge. And these are all approximations. I don't have the price list memorized. But you have like two kinds. You have one that you text and she says, I'll schedule your appointment. It costs this much. Please bring cash, or Kaspi, transfer me. And then you have ones that you show up into their homes and they welcome you to a dasturkhan, a feast, and they feed you and they talk to you and they try to understand what you're looking for, which is more of my experience because I felt it wasn't necessarily right to interview people who were charging me money. I always gave gifts and offerings to everyone I interviewed, but to charge me 20,000 tenge for an interview felt kind of crazy to me.
It's unethical, completely. I would never pay for an interview.
Yeah. And so the way they practice today is so fascinating. And when you talk to a lot of young people, they've gone for a lot of physical related problems. And so what I found is I've interviewed mostly women, with the exception of 2 men, where they have such a deep relationship with the earth. For example, like I visited a well in Western Kazakhstan where they told me the water had a composition that was 80% silver, and that a woman from Germany with stage 4 cancer came there and drank 4 liters of the water and her cancer went away. And of course, I'm not a medical professional, so I don't know if drinking silver water is good for you. I drank it when I was there.
But you didn't check it, right? You didn't contact the German woman.
No.
Okay, all right. So it's not like we're promoting it.
Yeah, no. I'm not saying they will cure your cancer, please.
Okay.
This is for insurance purposes. This is not medical advice. But so you have the healer whose function is to heal your body, whether it's a skin condition, whether it's fertility related, whether it's a broken foot, a broken back. And then you have the kumalaksha, or the fortune teller. And kumalak is, if you've ever been to a bazaar in Central Asia, you'll see a woman sitting with stones. And these stones are the kumalak. And they have, in modern times, begun to incorporate tarot card readings. And you have one of 2 experiences, and I have had both, where they sit and they read your tarot cards and they read the kumalak based on what you choose or how they shake them, etc. And they will tell you your future based on what you want to know. But a second experience that I had was in Kantao, which is a city which had a huge Greek population, where I had my coffee grounds read. I have also had a woman sit and recite the Quran while chanting the Quran, and then having visions of my future while she was chanting. And then the shaman is a bit more ambiguous in term. What they do is still kind of a bit of a mystery to me, because people go to them for so many different reasons. Some are asking what land they should build their farm on, what house they should buy, almost as if to have like the decision making done for them based on their expertise. And so this is, in modern Kazakhstan, these are the ways we see the shaman, the healer, and the fortune teller kind of integrate themselves into public life. But it's also important for me to say that every single person I've interviewed identifies as a Muslim. When I've talked to them about Tengrism, when I say Tengri, they go, yes, the sky god, of course. But when I say Tengrism, they go, I don't know what that means. Or they think that I am talking about fundamentalists, because they have a lot of conflict with fundamentalist Muslims in their regions as well. And so they then go on about how they don't like them, they don't trust them. Those men with the long beards, I don't trust them. And that really surprised me, because I felt that Tengrism must have been more of a public discourse, because I'm used to the bubble that Almaty is. But once you leave the bubble, this discourse isn't as potent.
But to be honest, I've also encountered a few people in Almaty who felt that the word Tengrism is political. And they didn't want to talk about Tengrism. They preferred to talk about shamanism. So I think it's also interesting how, this word became politicized for whatever reason. But what I wanted to ask you now is, so these kind of practices, as you just mentioned, so those shamanic practices, were they also practiced during the Soviet Union, or were they completely buried somewhere?
It's, of course, everyone I interview has different stories. So some people say their family practiced it in secret, only healing family members or animals that were on their farms. Some claim that their family totally suppressed any practice and told them to just live with the sickness they were experiencing. And some will tell you that it completely disappeared and that they had to learn everything on their own when they started having this sickness. One woman I interviewed in Turkestan told a story of her father's sister having these powers. And this woman was about 90. The story she was telling was from about the 30s. where she remembers in her childhood her father's sister being tied up and left in an attic to die because they were so scared of the repercussions of her having these powers that they chose to kill her for their own safety. And so she spent her whole life afraid of practicing this until the 80s, when other people in her community began practicing more publicly, or at least talking about it, during the Gorbachev reforms of perestroika and glasnost. And so this is, for many of the people I've interviewed, but of course it's the bias of my research because this is the time frame I'm studying, but for many of them, they felt that the 80s was a time of change for them, where they felt safer to publicly practice this. And so I think that it survived within communities, the way that like Islam survived in the mahallas in Uzbekistan, and the way that tradition is never hopefully truly lost if there's always someone to tell you about it. So it depends on who you ask, but in many instances, it was a secret held very close to their heart and was waiting for the moment where they could return to it.
So let's move to the cultural manifestation of Tengrism. We can see loads of jewelry and loads of accessories in Kazakhstan that are supposed to be ethnic. But I wonder if you find any Tengrist elements in the jewelry that is popular here now. And that's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question, what other ways Tengrism is being manifested culturally in Kazakhstan?
So for the first example of like in jewelry and in clothing is you see the petroglyphs that are at Tamgalitas being imprinted onto clothing all over the country and also in Kyrgyzstan. And I have, of course, bought some of this clothing, whether it be socks or earrings, and people get tattoos, and it's all very in fashion. It is directly related to this idea of this is just me being in touch with my culture. And depending on who you ask, there's Zira Nauruzbai's book called The Eternal Sky of the Kazakhs, where she evokes that the Sharanrak, or the top of the yurt, is also a Tengrist symbol, and that it's a symbol of the home, but also deeply and spiritually related to Tengrism, therefore making the national symbol of the Kazakh government also related to Tengrism, and so on and so forth. But there's also historians who study jewelry and national fashion who say that these symbols, and even the jewelry that maybe we have both bought, is not actually related to anything historically that we see in Kazakhstan, or that Turkmens are super famous for their jewelry, and so Kazakhs and Uzbeks maybe have appropriated this style into their own jewelry because they don't have the historical records to perfectly recreate this. And so I think the conversation about fashion and jewelry is, unfortunately, everything about this is very controversial to people, which I always am a bit nervous to talk about my own perceptions of it because I don't want people to think poorly of me. But I do think that the desire to get in touch with one's culture is really important. But what do we have to say about accuracy? Like, just because you're getting in touch with your own culture, does that mean you have to be accurate? And so it's the question of authenticity, the question of tradition, and how do you embrace it in a meaningful way, even if some people view that it's not accurate. And I've completely forgotten your second question.
No, I wanted to ask about in what ways we can see Tengrism in this cultural sphere. So what are the other ways in which Tengrism is kind of entering the Kazakh culture, or like Central Asian culture in general?
I think that social media is such an incredible vessel for this, and that so many people, maybe in your everyday life, you don't experience anything related to Tengrism or Tengri. You see every once in a while on a t-shirt, Tengri. Every once in a while, you see Tengri news, you think about Tengri Bank, you go to Tengri Fest, and you see the name. And I think there's that kind of everyday exposure. It's great marketing. But when you go onto Instagram, or even there's a Telegram channel that I follow called Zhol Tengri, or Zhol Tengrianstvo, I can't quite remember the name right now, where they talk about different aspects of Kazakh culture and how that's directly related to Tengrism. And so I think the movement that we talk about when we talk about young people and Tengrism is almost entirely online. I know that they have their community and they meet together, but in the public eye, they're not staging protests. They're not taking to the street, doing worship in the style of like, I was just in Georgia and there was a man driving around in a car and he was playing like Christian Bible quotes. Like, we don't have people who are proselytizing Tengrism to the masses. And so it's fully reliant on young people, not to only young people, but it is mostly young people who feel that Islam doesn't fulfill them religiously or spiritually or even just in their identity, but Tengrism does. And even in my master's, a lot of people said that they identify as a Tengrist, but they do not worship Tengri. Like they are a Tengrist who is a Muslim, or they're a Muslim who is a Tengrist, that these two things coexist. But what I see starting to happen, and based on conversations I've had with people involved in this movement, that this idea isn't as okay as it's been in the past, and they're beginning to fracture because we're seeing a changing movement of Islam in Kazakhstan. I've been visiting Kazakhstan for a decade. In the last 3 years, I've seen women wearing hijabs, like Saudi-style hijabs, for the first time in my life. And the way that Islam has changed so much, where people used to say, oh, I just don't eat pork, but I drink and I party. And now people don't do that. And we're seeing kind of a halal culture forming online, which is also happening on Instagram with like halal influencers and girls who move to Saudi and come back and teach young Kazakh women how to be properly Muslim. And so I think the urgency for Tengrism is in opposition to this, because people no longer feel that you can be both and that these things coexist together.
And what does it look like in other Central Asian countries? You mentioned Kyrgyzstan, but do we know anything about, the revival of Tengrism in Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan, Tajikistan?
Honestly, in the case of Uzbekistan, I know that it has become an interesting topic in Kazakhstan specifically. It's of course not my country of specialty. So I really wanted to actually do interviews in Kazakhstan to talk to people about their spiritual beliefs, because Kazakhs and Kazakhs have such a close relationship as being nomadic peoples. But it's hard to say, and I know nothing about Tengrism in Turkmenistan. It would involve me talking to people, which I don't have the luxury of doing, unfortunately. But when I've met Turkmens abroad, they relate to Tengrism in the same way that I think an average Kazakh does, where it's, this is like our traditional religion. This is what we've always done. And now today it's combined with Islam and we have our traditional practices. But it's also the issue of conflating all shamanic practice to Tengrism. And so because we're never going to be able to separate these two, to somebody, shamanism is Tengrism, and maybe to their shaman, it's Islam, Sufism. That's the other big question in my PhD, which is whatever happened to Sufism in Central Asia. I can't speak to that, but I think the first time we ever met, you told me that Tengrism has become quite popular in Poland as part of the far-right nationalist movement.
Yeah.
And it's also very popular in Bulgaria and Hungary, also part of the far-right nationalist movements. Actually, tying this back to earlier, that might also be something the Kazakh government sees and is worried about, that if they legitimize Tengrism, that there's going to be a rise of a far-right movement that they can't even begin to fathom, because they see it happening in places in Europe. And so that could also, I hadn't even thought of that until now.
Yeah, I mean, I think they just incorporate those like more like Slavic beliefs and Slavic mythology, which is still kind of it's kind of similar in its assumptions to Tengris. I'm not a specialist. Again, I don't want to get into that, but I know that paganism is definitely part of the far-right sort of revival and Slavic revival. But what I wanted to ask you also is how shamanism and Tengrism has been preserved in like everyday rituals, because this is what people in Almaty sometimes have been telling me, that maybe their grandmas, maybe their mothers have some rituals that actually go back to Tengrist beliefs or Tengrist practices, but it's just part of everyday life. So Can you give us some examples about these kind of practices?
This definitely differs family to family because it's also rooted in what the family's priorities or powers are, of course. But I think that things like cleansing the home is definitely something that we see, not maybe every day, but that it is a priority to cleanse the home, to care for the home in a certain way. Participating in ancestor worship is a huge facet of Kazakh society, which is why the ancestor worship is also very contentious in the Tengrism Islam debate, because it's not something we traditionally see as much in Islam. And for me, actually, as a Buddhist from Thailand, a lot of the everyday spirituality things remind me a lot of my own mother and my grandmother, and this kind of Buddhist practice of we have to keep our home a certain way, we have to care for things a certain way, we have to, I'm not allowed to live on the bottom floor of a apartment building and things like that.
Okay.
But
why?
Bugs. Mostly bugs. But I think that there are families where even visiting the healer, shaman, fortune teller on a weekly basis is a huge part of the everyday practice, where you go not even just for, there's some people who go for major events, like a broken back or serious health-related issues, and that's the first time they've visited someone in years. But then there's also the families where they go every single week to ask for a blessing, to say, my child has an exam this week, please help them. Please help our daughter find a husband. Please help me get pregnant, etc. And so I think that is actually the most religious aspect of it to me, where it reminds me of going to a Sunday service almost, where you go to mass and you ask for a blessing and you ask for forgiveness and you cleanse your soul, you cleanse your body, you cleanse your mind by going through these practices. And a lot of my friends find this very traumatizing to talk about because they hated going as kids. There's a woman at the Green Bazaar who spits in your face. She spat in my face and she views it as part of her practice. And I said to my friend, I was like, if I was a child and someone did this to me, I would also never visit a shaman again.
Yeah, well, Green Bazaar, by the way, is in central Almaty. So if any of our listeners are in town, you can try yourself.
Yeah, before they renovate it.
Thank you, Abby. That was fascinating. Tell me, is there any way we can read your PhD or your master's dissertation?
My master's dissertation is open source, available online currently. So if you just Google my name and scroll down on Google, it's called Tengrism as a Lived Religion in Kazakhstan. And my PhD I am currently writing, but I promise you can all read it when it's finally done.
Okay, so maybe let me know when it's done. Maybe we can write something together and publish on Tyrantels, because I'm sure that it will be a topic that will interest our listeners. So thank you so much, Abby, and all the best to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Tyrantels on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.